They threw her out like she was nothing. Right there in the middle of Harlan's feed and supply. In front of every person who had ever pretended to smile at her, Dale Whitmore grabbed his daughter by the arm, walked her to the door, and told her she was an embarrassment to the family name. Not quietly. Not with any mercy. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough for Ida Prentice to stop counting coins at the counter, loud enough for the two ranch hands by the seed bins to go still. Eliza stood on that porch with her coat half buttoned and her bag dropped at her feet, and not one person inside moved to help her. That was the moment everything changed, and if you had been standing in her boots that morning, your own father's voice carrying out into the cold, every eye in town watching, nowhere left to go, you have to ask yourself, what would you have done? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end, because this story is about what happens when the world decides you're worthless and you decide to prove every single one of them wrong. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled, and if it moves you, tap that like button. It means more than you know. The thing about Eliza Whitmore was that she had never been small in spirit, only in luck. She was 26 years old and had spent most of those years trying not to take up too much space, not because anyone asked her to, no one had to. The town of Grady's Bend, Montana Territory, had ways of making certain people feel the edges of their welcome without ever saying a word directly. A glance held half a second too long. A laugh that stops when you walk into a room. A kind of silence that lands like a door closing in your face. Eliza was heavy-set in a world that had very specific ideas about what a woman ought to look like, and she had been living with the weight of that judgment since she was old enough to understand it. She wasn't broken by it, not exactly, but she was tired in the way that people get tired when they've been carrying something heavy for years without putting it down once. She had worked at Harlan's feed and supply for 2 years. Showed up before the other two employees most mornings, stayed after closing when the accounts didn't balance. Learned the inventory by memory because Harlan himself had the organizational instincts of a man who kept important papers inside his hat. She was good at the job. She knew she was good at the job. Harlan knew it too, which was why what happened on the morning of November 3rd was the kind of thing that didn't make any logical sense until you remembered that logic had very little to do with how the world treated certain women. Dale Whitmore walked through the front door of the supply store at 9:30, and the air in the room shifted the way it always did when Dale entered a place. He was Eliza's father by blood and very little else. A man who had spent his adult life being respected by people who confused his bluntness for intelligence and his cruelty for discipline. He had broad shoulders and a voice that carried, and the kind of face that made strangers assume he was in charge of whatever room he occupied. He had not come to buy feed. Eliza knew that the moment she saw him. She was behind the counter sorting invoices, and she watched him move past the displays without looking at them, and her stomach dropped before a single word had been said. Eliza. Just her name. Nothing else. But the way he said it. Papa. She set the invoices down. I'm working. Not anymore, you're not. He looked at Harlan, who had emerged from the back room and was now doing a very poor job of pretending not to hear. I spoke to Harlan this morning. You're finished here. The room went quiet enough that Eliza could hear the wind pushing against the front windows. You spoke to... She stopped. Looked at Harlan. Harlan was studying his own boots like they contained the secrets of the universe. Harlan, did he... Your father brought some concerns to my attention, Harlan said to his boots. What concerns? Eliza's voice was steady. She was proud of that later. I have done nothing wrong here. Nothing. You know that. It's not about wrong or right. Harlan finally looked up, and there was something in his face that wasn't quite regret. More like the expression of a man who has decided the cost of decency is too high. It's about the shop's reputation. People talk, Eliza, about the situation. The situation. She repeated the word flatly. People don't want to do business in a place where the owner's daughter, Dale started. I'm not your asset, Eliza said. I'm an employee here, and I've done my job. You're my daughter, Dale said, like that answered everything. Like that was the whole argument, closed and final. And you've become an embarrassment to this family and to this town. The way you carry yourself, the way you... He made a gesture with his hand, vague and damning, that she understood completely, that she had always understood. It reflects on us. I won't have it anymore. The invoices were still on the counter. She had organized them by date. She had been 3/4 finished. She picked up her bag from beneath the counter. She did it slowly because she needed to do something with her hands or she was going to break something, and she could not afford to break something. She came out from behind the counter, and her father stepped back as she approached the door, as if proximity to her was its own kind of problem. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "You told him to fire me," she said. "Your own daughter, because people talk." "This is for your own good," Dale said. "You need to go somewhere that makes sense for you, somewhere you won't embarrass." "Don't." Her voice cracked, just slightly, just once. "Don't tell me this is for me." She walked out. The door swung shut behind her. She stood on the porch and counted to 10 because her hands were shaking, and she was not going to walk away from this shaking. The cold was sharp, the sky overhead the particular flat gray of a Montana November, and she stood there holding the strap of her bag and staring at the main road and trying to figure out what a person did when the floor had just dropped out from under their life. Inside, through the window, she could see Ida Prentice resume counting her coins. She could see Harlan disappear back into the storeroom. She could see her father speaking to someone, already moving on, already done with the matter of his daughter. Nobody came out after her. She was not surprised. But not being surprised by something doesn't make it hurt less. It just means you see it coming and it hits you anyway. She walked. She didn't have a direction. She just needed to move because standing still felt like suffocating. She went north along the main road, past the post office, past the barber shop with its striped pole, past the little dry goods store where Martha Keene stood in the window, and watched her pass with the particular expression of a woman cataloging something she'd tell people about later. At the end of the road was the boarding house where Eliza had rented a room for the past 18 months. Mrs. Gallagher's place, $2 a week, cold in the mornings, hot water unreliable, but clean and quiet and hers. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, opened her door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. She had $4.60. She had a room she couldn't afford for more than 2 weeks. She had no job, no reference she could trust Harlan to give her honestly, and a father who had just demonstrated publicly that her humiliation was not only acceptable but preferable to his reputation. She sat there for a long time, long enough for the light to change outside her window, for the sounds of the town's midday business to rise and thin and quiet again. She was not crying. She had tried crying about her father's opinions once, at 15, and had decided it wasn't worth the headache. What she was doing was thinking. She was good at that, thinking. It was one of the things that had never been taken from her, even when everything else seemed to be shrinking. She thought clearly under pressure, sorted problems into their components, found the thing that was fixable and worked from there. She had done it all her life. It was the skill she had developed in the absence of other advantages. The problem, sorted out plainly, she needed work. She needed work that her father could not interfere with, which meant something outside Grady's Bend or outside the reach of his particular kind of social pressure. She needed it quickly. She needed it to pay enough to live on. She had spent 2 years at a feed store. She knew cattle supplies, feed ratios, inventory management, and she had spent a fair portion of her private hours reading every agricultural manual and animal husbandry text she could get her hands on, partly because she found it genuinely interesting, and partly because she had learned early that knowledge was something no one could take out of your hands without your permission. It was Mrs. Gallagher who came to her door around 3 in the afternoon, knocking with the particular softness of a woman who had heard things and wasn't sure how to proceed. "There's a notice," Mrs. Gallagher said, handing over a folded piece of paper like it was evidence. "Came through the post office last week. I was going to pass it along sooner, but She trailed off. The reason didn't matter. "It's ranch work out on the Rourke property, 20 miles north." Eliza unfolded the paper. It was not technically a help-wanted notice. It was more of a desperate statement of facts. Caleb Rourke, operating a cattle ranch on the East Fork of the Gallatin River, required immediate assistance with general ranch operations, room and board provided. Wages negotiable. Experience preferred but not required. The handwriting was rough, and the grammar was a person who had written the thing in a hurry and regretted putting it in the mail at all. "Caleb Rourke," Eliza said. Mrs. Gallagher made a sound. "What does that mean?" Eliza asked. It means, Mrs. Gallagher said carefully, that he's not an easy man. He runs that ranch alone since his hands walked off. They say he's particular about things. Particular. Difficult. Mrs. Gallagher seemed to be choosing every word the way you choose footing on ice. He doesn't like people much. He doesn't like being told anything. He's had 3 housekeepers in 2 years, and none of them lasted the month. Eliza looked at the paper again. 20 miles north. Room and board, wages negotiable. I'm not going to be a housekeeper, she said. Mrs. Gallagher blinked. What? If I go out there, it won't be to clean his kitchen. She folded the paper in half and held it. Do you know what's wrong with his operation? Why the hands walked off? I heard the cattle were sick, and that the Alderman Ranch, that's the big spread just west of his, has been pushing against his property line for years. People say Wade Alderman wants that land, has wanted it for a long time. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Wade Alderman, she said. He's the one who spoke to your father this morning, Mrs. Gallagher said, and then put her hand over her mouth like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. The room went very still. Eliza looked at the woman she had rented from for 18 months, at the embarrassment in her face, and understood something that rearranged several other things in her mind all at once. Wade Alderman, who wanted land to the north, who had spoken to her father this morning right before her father had walked into Harlan's and had her removed. She didn't know the shape of it yet, but she knew the smell of it. Thank you, she said, for the notice. Mrs. Gallagher left. Eliza sat back down on the bed and looked at the notice in her hands and felt something she hadn't felt in several hours, which was a very specific, very cold form of interest. The next morning, she asked around carefully, without drawing attention. The name Wade Alderman turned up in 3 different conversations before noon. He was, by general consensus, one of the most powerful men in the county. He had been buying up land and influence for 15 years. He had friends in the land office, friends on the town council, and a manner that people described as charming until they described him more carefully, at which point words like ruthless and calculating tended to appear. He had wanted the Rourke land for years, according to a man at the livery who had no particular reason to keep secrets. The Rourke spread sat right across a water source that Alderman needed to expand his operation east. He'd made offers. Caleb Rourke had refused every one of them. So Alderman had started, quietly, methodically, doing other things. Driving away the hands, spreading rumors about the herd's health that made buyers hesitant, finding ways to put pressure on the edges of Rourke's operation until the whole thing started to look like it was collapsing on its own. And now, having run Eliza out of her job, apparently as some kind of favor or leverage against her father, the details of which she didn't have yet, Alderman had inadvertently done something he hadn't intended. He had pointed her directly at Caleb Rourke's door. She packed her bag that afternoon. She paid Mrs. Gallagher through the end of the week, which left her $3.10, which was not much but was something. She arranged for a ride north with a feed delivery going that direction, traded 2 hours of help loading bags for the seat on the wagon, and spent the ride watching the land flatten and harden and the distance between homesteads grow. The Rourke Ranch came into view as the light was going, and her first impression was not of a dying operation, but of something that had been fighting its own dying for a long time and was starting to lose the argument. The main house was solid, but needed paint. The fence line visible from the road had gaps in 2 places she could see from the wagon. The cattle in the near pasture were thin in a way that spoke more to feed management than illness. She recognized the particular shape of that thinness from her time with the manuals. The wagon driver left her at the gate. He didn't offer to take her further. She walked up the path to the house and knocked. A long silence. Then footsteps, heavy and deliberate, the kind that belonged to a man who walked like every step was a decision. The door opened. Caleb Rourke was taller than she expected, and looked like someone had assembled him from spare parts that were each individually too much, too broad, too weathered, too sharp in the jaw, and too cold in the eyes. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older, in the way that men who work outdoors age differently than everyone else. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You've got the wrong place." "Caleb Rourke," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" "Eliza Whitmore. I'm here about the notice." He stared at her. "The notice I put out was for ranch work. Yes, hard work, physical work. Feeding, mending, managing cattle and supplies. I know what ranch work is." Something moved across his face that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt. Something between the two. Something that people who have been alone for a long time develop for unexpected situations. "You read the notice and thought, what exactly?" "I thought," Eliza said, "that you have a sick herd, a broken fence line, supply mismanagement, and a competitor who is systematically trying to put you under, and that you've been trying to solve those problems alone, which is why they're getting worse." She looked at him steadily. "I also thought you were probably running low on options, which means you don't have the luxury of being selective about who shows up willing to work." The silence that followed was the kind that could have gone several directions. Caleb Rourke looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the cold seeping through her coat and had to work to keep her expression level. He was doing the calculation. She could see it, the same calculation that people had been running on her face her entire life, reaching the same usual conclusion. "You've done ranch work before," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I've studied it. I know cattle nutrition, I know supply management, and I know basic veterinary treatment for common herd illnesses." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I've been on a working ranch, but I've spent 2 years learning everything about them from every written source I could find." "Books," he said, "and 2 years at a feed store watching what ranchers bought and why and what they came back needing because the first approach didn't work." He looked at her bag. He looked at her. He looked past her at the darkening road she'd walked up alone. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "It's not warm. The stove is old." "All right. I'm not running a charity. I'm not asking for one." He held the door open. She walked through it. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that the moment she crossed that threshold was the moment Wade Alderman's careful, systematic plan to acquire the Rourke land started running into something it hadn't accounted for. She didn't know it yet. But she walked in anyway, because she had run out of other doors. And sometimes that is the only kind of courage that's available. And sometimes that kind is enough. The room off the kitchen was exactly as cold as Caleb had said it would be, and he had not been exaggerating for effect. There was a narrow bed frame with a mattress that had seen better decades, a small table with one leg shorter than the others, and a window that let in a thin ribbon of night air through a gap in the frame that someone had stuffed with rags and then forgotten about. The stove in the kitchen was old in the way that things become old when they are used hard and maintained poorly. It worked, but it complained about it, and the heat it produced was uneven and territorial, warming one corner of the kitchen while leaving the rest to fend for itself. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Somewhere deeper in the building, she could hear Caleb moving, heavy, deliberate steps, a door closing, then silence. She did not sleep well. She hadn't expected to. What she did, in the hours before exhaustion finally won, was think. She turned over everything she'd learned about the Rourke operation on the ride up, everything she'd observed from the gate, everything in the careful non-answers Caleb had given when she'd asked basic questions about the herd over the sparse, uncomfortable dinner they'd shared at opposite ends of a long table. He had answered her questions the way a man answers questions he considers none of your business, but lacks the specific energy to refuse. In fragments, with pauses, watching her like he was waiting for her to reveal what she was actually after. She understood that. She even respected it, a little. A man who'd been having his operation methodically undermined for 2 years had good reasons to be suspicious of people who showed up offering help. What she had gathered between the fragments and the pauses, the herd was down to 63 head from nearly 90 the previous spring. 3 of the remaining hands had quit in September, citing unpaid wages, though from what she could tell, the wages had eventually been paid, just late, which meant the cash flow was the real problem. 2 of those 3 had gone to work for Alderman's spread within the week, which told her something. The feed supplier in Grady's Bend had recently changed their payment terms, requiring cash on delivery instead of the 30-day arrangement they'd had for years. That change had coincided, she noted, with the period when Wade Alderman had apparently taken a more active interest in town business. She knew the shape of what was being done to this ranch, even if she didn't yet have all the details. She had seen it in smaller versions at the feed store. The quiet, patient application of pressure at every external point until the thing in the middle had no room left to breathe. Alderman wasn't doing anything illegal, probably. He was just being thorough. The question was whether there was anything left to work with, whether the 63 head could be brought back to health, whether the operation could be stabilized fast enough to matter, whether Caleb Rourke was the kind of man who could be convinced to accept help from someone he had every social reason to dismiss. She fell asleep thinking about feed ratios. It was not a peaceful sleep, but it was the sleep of a person with a problem to solve, which was, in its own way, a kind of purpose. She was up before dawn. The kitchen was dark and the stove had gone cold overnight, and she spent 20 minutes getting it lit again because the flue damper was sticking, another thing that needed attention, filed in the growing list, before she found coffee and a battered pot, and had something ready by the time the light outside started to change from black to the dark gray of an early Montana morning. She heard Caleb's footsteps on the stairs, and then he came into the kitchen doorway and stopped. He looked at the coffee. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. "The damper on the flue sticks," she said. "If you push it to the left before you open it, it moves more easily." He came to the table and poured himself coffee and stood there drinking it, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed in the posture of a man who was reserving judgment. He was wearing yesterday's clothes, which told her he'd slept badly too, or possibly not at all. "I want to see the herd this morning," she said. "All of them. And the feed storage." "Why?" "Because I need to know what I'm actually working with before I can tell you what's wrong." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "I didn't hire you to tell me what's wrong." "What did you hire me to do?" A pause. "I don't know yet," he said, which was a more honest answer than she'd expected, and she marked it. "Then let me start by looking," she said. "You don't have to take anything I say seriously, but looking doesn't cost you anything." He drank his coffee. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove working and the first sounds of morning outside. He didn't agree exactly, but when he set his cup down and reached for his coat, he left the door open behind him. She followed. The cattle were in the north pasture, and her first look at them in daylight confirmed what she'd suspected. They weren't catastrophically ill. This wasn't a disease situation, or not primarily, but they were thin in a specific way that meant they'd been on inadequate feed for longer than a season. She walked the fence line while Caleb watched her from a distance, hands in his pockets, and she looked at the animals carefully, noting the ones that were thinner than the others, the ones that showed signs of the kind of low-grade respiratory congestion that came from stress and poor nutrition rather than infection. "What are you feeding them?" she said when she came back to where he was standing. "Same as I always have." "How much?" He told her. She did the arithmetic in her head. "That's short by about a third for cattle at this weight, in this temperature. You're underfeeding them, and they're using what they eat just to stay warm, so they're not gaining anything." He looked at her. "I know how to feed cattle." "I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying your feed supply got cut." She watched his face. "When did the delivery terms change?" "When they went to cash on delivery." A longer pause this time. "October. And what were you doing before that to stretch what you had?" Something shifted in his expression, a tightening, a recognition of something he hadn't said out loud. Rationing. Which made them weaker, which made them more vulnerable to the cold, which is why 3 of them didn't make it to November. She said it plainly, without accusation, because it wasn't an accusation. It was a sequence of events that had been engineered from outside. "This isn't mismanagement on your part, Mr. Rourke. Someone changed the conditions on you fast enough that there was no good adjustment to make." He was quiet for a long time. Around them, the cattle moved slowly, their breath visible in the cold air. "Alderman got to my feed supplier," he said. Not a question, like something finally said aloud that had been living in his chest for weeks. "That's what I'd guess. I'd want to verify it." She looked back at the herd. "Can you get a feed delivery from outside the county? There's a supplier out of Billings who does long-haul orders. Their prices are higher, but their terms are standard net 30. Caleb stared at her. "How do you know about a Billings supplier?" "Because I worked at a feed store for 2 years and I read every trade circular that came through the door." She met his look. I also know that their minimum order is higher than what you'd typically order in a month. But if we can project forward, consolidate the order, and get the herd back to proper feeding weight over the next 6 weeks, you'll recover the cost in the spring market." She paused. "Assuming we fix the feed situation and a few other things." "What other things?" She had made a list. Not on paper. She hadn't wanted to show up on his land her first morning carrying a written list of his failures, because she understood how that would land, but in her head, in order of urgency. She told him the first 3. He listened. His jaw tightened a couple of times. He didn't interrupt her, which she hadn't been certain he was capable of until it happened. When she finished, he said, "You learned all that from books." "From books and from watching what went wrong on other people's operations." She held his look. "I know that's not the same as doing it, but I'm standing here asking you to let me try. And I'm going to be honest with you. The alternative is that you keep doing what you've been doing alone, and in 6 more weeks you might not have 63 head anymore." The wind came in cold off the open ground, and neither of them moved. "The fence along the south pasture," he said finally. "There are 3 sections down. I saw 2 from the road. I'll find the 3rd. He turned and walked back toward the barn. She took that as the beginning of something. The days that followed were not easy, and she would not have called them good, but they had a quality she had been missing for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. They had direction. She woke before him, got the stove going, had coffee ready. She worked through the mornings on whatever was most urgent, and in the afternoons she walked every inch of the property she could cover on foot, cataloging. The fence repair she started herself with wire and posts she found stacked behind the barn, unused. Someone had bought supplies for the repair and then never done it, which was the kind of thing that happened when a crew walked off in the middle of a season. Caleb watched her the way he watched most things, from a distance, reserving comment. He was not mean to her. He was not warm either. He occupied a range of interaction that ran between minimal and functional, and she learned to read the difference between his silences. The silence that meant he disagreed was different from the silence that meant he was thinking, and both were different from the silence that meant he was waiting for her to fail. That last silence was the most frequent at first. He had a way of showing up wherever she was working, not to help, but to observe. She'd be partway through a feed calculation, and she'd look up, and he'd be in the barn doorway. She'd be rehanging a section of fence, and she'd turn around and he'd be 20 yards back. She found it unsettling for the first couple of days, and then she decided to stop finding it unsettling, because she was not going to be watched out of this job the way she'd been watched out of everything else. "You don't have to stand out there," she said one morning, when she was assessing the condition of the stored grain, and he'd been in the doorway for 10 minutes. "You can come in." "I can see fine from here." "What are you looking for?" "Mistakes." She turned back to the grain. "That's fair," she said. He came inside. That was in its small way a shift. It was on the 4th day that she found the account books. She hadn't gone looking for them exactly. She'd asked Caleb for the supply invoices from the past year so she could trace the pattern of the delivery changes, and he'd brought her a wooden box that contained the invoices, 3 seasons of account ledgers, and what appeared to be a contract. She looked at the contract and felt the hairs on her arms stand up. It was a grazing rights agreement, a temporary one dated 14 months ago, in which Caleb had agreed to allow the alderman operation to run 50 head of cattle on the eastern section of his land in exchange for a lump payment. A standard enough arrangement in tight seasons, except that buried in the language on the second page was a clause that she read 3 times to make sure she was understanding it correctly. The clause established that if the primary party, Caleb, failed to maintain the land to the standards defined in an attached addendum, the rights could be extended indefinitely and the compensation renegotiated at the second party's discretion. The addendum defined maintenance standards in language that was specific enough to be precise and vague enough to be argued any number of ways. Fence condition, herd health, water access. Things that, if a man's operation was under financial stress and his feed supply had been deliberately disrupted and his crew had been poached, might very well fall below the defined standards. She sat with that contract for a long time. The stove in the kitchen was making its usual complaints. Outside, she could hear Caleb working somewhere on the property. She thought about what she knew about Wade Alderman, the patience of him, the methodical quality of what he was doing. He wasn't rushing. He had set this up 14 months ago, before the herd started declining, before the hands left. He had put the mechanism in place first, and then applied the conditions that would trigger it. She thought about the fact that someone had spoken to her father, had used her father as an instrument, to get her out of the one position in Grady's Bend where she'd had access to information about feed suppliers and delivery terms and the financial condition of local ranch operations. She didn't know yet exactly how her father fit into Alderman's calculations, but the coincidence was too precise to be a coincidence. She was still sitting there when Caleb came in from outside, tracking mud through the kitchen the way he always did without appearing to notice it. He stopped when he saw her expression. "What?" he said. She put the contract on the table and pushed it toward him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "The grazing rights agreement," she said. "You knew about the maintenance clause?" "I knew it was there." He sat down heavily across from her. "My understanding was that it was standard language." "It's not standard. The addendum is specific enough that someone with a cooperative land assessor could argue you're already in violation." She watched him take that in. "Has Alderman sent anyone to assess the property recently?" Something crossed his face. "Man came out 6 weeks ago, said he was from the county land office, did a survey." "And you didn't receive any documentation from that visit?" "I received a letter 3 weeks ago saying the survey was routine and complete." She thought about that. 3 weeks ago. Right around the time the feed delivery terms had changed. "He's building a file," she said. "He's collecting documentation that your operation is in decline so that when he triggers that clause, he has paper to back it up." She looked at Caleb across the table. "How long have you been sitting on this contract without showing it to anyone? A lawyer, anyone?" His jaw tightened. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "I know." She didn't say it with judgment. "I know you don't. But, Mr. Rourke, this contract is the problem. Everything else, the feed, the hands, the delivery terms, those are how he's making the contract applicable. If we fix the operation and the property condition and you're no longer in technical violation, the clause has no teeth." He was looking at the contract like it had bit him. "He had me sign something that let him come for me on my own land," he said. His voice was level, but only the way a man's voice is level when he is pressing hard on something to keep it from coming out. "Yes," she said. "He did." "I'm not a stupid man." "No, you're not. You're a man who needed cash in a tight season and didn't have a lawyer reading contracts for you." She leaned forward. "He's done this before. I'd bet money on it. This kind of arrangement doesn't come from someone improvising. It comes from someone who has a method." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The kitchen ticked and settled around them. "What do you need?" he said finally. "I need to know every agreement you have with Alderman or anyone connected to him, written and verbal. I need the last 3 years of supply invoices, and I need to contact the Billings feed supplier and get an order in before this week is out." She paused. "And I need you to stop treating me like I'm going to fail, because I don't have time to prove myself to you in small pieces while this man dismantles your ranch." The silence that followed that was different from the other silences. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look from before, not the wait and see, something more complicated than that. Something she wasn't sure he had a lot of practice doing. "I'll get you the invoices," he said. He stood up and left the room. She exhaled slowly, turned the contract over in her hands, and read the maintenance clause one more time. The week that followed was the hardest she had worked in her adult life, and she had not had an easy adult life. She was up before dawn every day and working past dark most nights. The fence sections got repaired. She did 3 of them herself, and Caleb, wordlessly, did the 4th. The feed order went into Billings, a larger order than Caleb was comfortable with financially, and she sat with him at the kitchen table and walked him through the math, the projected weight recovery, the spring market prices, until he could see the arithmetic for himself. He didn't like being shown arithmetic. He absorbed it carefully, objected twice on details that were legitimate objections, and then agreed. She found 2 more issues she hadn't expected. One of the water troughs in the south pasture had a slow leak that had been compensated for by refilling, every day, without anyone apparently asking why it needed daily refilling. She fixed the trough and calculated that they'd been losing enough water to meaningfully affect the cattle nearest that section. The second issue was a stack of supply invoices showing that the ranch had been billed for a consistent order of mineral supplements every month for 16 months. Supplements that should have been, if used as directed, producing measurably better herd health than what she was seeing. She found the supplements in a back corner of the feed room, 6 months of them, unopened. She stood in the feed room for a while after finding that. She brought it to Caleb that evening. She put the invoices on the table beside the still sealed bags, and she didn't say anything, and he looked at them and understood. "The hands," he said. "Yes." She sat down. Someone was taking the supplements and selling them and filing the expenses as used. She paused. How long before September did things start going wrong with the herd? He thought about it. Spring. Late spring. Right around when someone would have started redirecting the supplements. She looked at him carefully. "I'm not going to tell you those men didn't need money. Maybe they did. But someone gave them a reason to start doing it when they did, and I'd like to know who." Caleb's hands were flat on the table. "Alderman. I don't have proof, but yes, that's my guess." He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the dark property, his back to her, and she could see the particular tension in his shoulders of a man who has just understood something he wishes he hadn't had to understand. "I've lived on this land for 18 years, he said. She didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say to it that would make it better. "My father built the first section of that fence," he said. "The north section, by the river. I've replaced half the posts, but some of the wire is original." She waited. "I'm not selling," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever this takes." "I know," she said. He turned around. He looked at her across the kitchen, and there was something in it that was different from every other time he'd looked at her since she'd arrived. Not warmer exactly, but more direct, like he had stopped looking for what was wrong with her and was looking at what was actually there. "The Billings order," he said. "When does it arrive?" "Thursday, if the road's passable." "I'll make sure it is." He went upstairs. She sat at the table with the invoices and the sealed supplement bags and the contract and her notes. And for the first time since she'd walked through his door, she felt something that was tentatively close to traction. She didn't let herself feel too much of it. Traction was not victory. And Wade Alderman was patient, careful, and not yet done. She had been on the ranch 12 days when one of Alderman's men rode through the gate. She was repairing the hinge on the barn door. It had been dragging for what looked like months, wearing a groove into the ground, when she heard the horse. She straightened up and watched the rider come down the path from the gate. He was a big man on a good horse, wearing a coat that cost more than anything in the feed room, and he rode like someone who had practiced looking casual about the fact that he was riding onto someone else's property uninvited. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way men like him looked at women like her. A quick appraisal, a summary judgment, the particular dismissal that happened faster than thought. "I'm looking for Rourke," he said. "He's not available," she said. "I'll wait." "He'll be unavailable for the rest of the day. Can I take a message?" The man looked around the property with the comfortable survey of someone conducting an assessment, and she understood that that was exactly what he was doing. "You work here?" he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "Since recently." She held the hinge in one hand and a wrench in the other, and she didn't move. "Who are you?" "Tom Garrett. I manage the Alderman operation." He said it the way people state facts that are designed to produce an effect. "Tell Rourke that Mr. Alderman would like to schedule a conversation about the terms of the grazing agreement, at his convenience." "I'll tell him." Garrett didn't leave immediately. He sat on his horse and looked at the barn, the house, the fence line. He was counting, she realized, estimating. His eyes moved the way an accountant's move, pricing things, comparing them to what they'd been. "Things are looking a little better out here," he said finally, in a tone that suggested this was not entirely welcome information. "We've been busy," she said. He looked at her one more time with the same summary dismissal as before, except this time something underneath it was slightly different. A recalculation, maybe. A small one. Then he turned his horse and rode out. She watched him go. She finished the hinge, She went inside and told Caleb what had been said, all of it, including the way Garrett's eyes had moved across the property. He was doing an assessment, she said. Alderman is checking the condition of the operation, either to see whether his strategy is working or to see whether it's already worked enough to act on that contract clause. Caleb was quiet. He's going to move on that clause, she said. I don't know when, but he's building to it, which means we need to move faster than we're moving, and we need to start looking at whether there's any legal avenue to challenge the contract itself. I told you, I don't have money for a lawyer. I know. She thought about what she knew, about the men she'd heard mentioned in town, about the network of obligations and relationships that existed in a county like this one. But a man who's been running a methodical land acquisition scheme for years has probably done this to someone else before you. And that person, or those people, might have a very strong interest in a legal challenge to how that contract was constructed. She looked at him. Do you know anyone Alderman has made an agreement with in the past that went badly for them? Caleb thought. It was a long pause. There was a homesteader, he said slowly, about 30 miles east, lost his water rights 3 years back. Name a Pryor. Henry Pryor. He looked up. People said he signed something he shouldn't have. Henry Pryor, she said. She filed it. The feed order arrived on Thursday as scheduled. Caleb had the road clear and she was at the gate when the wagon came through, and for the first time in 12 days she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Because there was feed in the wagon, and the herd was still alive, and the week had gone the way she'd needed it to go. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect. There had been 2 days where Caleb had said almost nothing to her, and she'd gone to bed uncertain whether he still believed this was worth continuing. There had been a morning where she'd made an error in the feed calculation and caught it herself and fixed it, but the catching it had required a full hour of reworking, and she'd been short-tempered the rest of the day. She was not making this look easy, because it wasn't easy. But the feed was here. The fence was repaired. The water trough held. The cattle were not getting worse, and 2 of them in the north section showed signs of beginning to recover their condition. She watched the delivery being unloaded, and she made herself remember the morning her father had walked through Harlan's door. She made herself hold that memory because she had discovered in the past 12 days that it was useful. Not because it hurt her, but because it reminded her exactly what she was doing here and why she could not afford to fail. That evening, Caleb came into the kitchen while she was going over the notes she'd made on Henry Pryor. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her. I'm going to ask you something, he said. She put her pen down. All right. Why are you still here? He said it simply, without the edge she might have expected. You didn't come out here for the wages. I know that, and you know I know it. You could have found other work somewhere that wasn't this complicated. She was quiet for a moment. I came because there was nowhere else to go, she said. And I'm staying because... She stopped, thought about it honestly. Because this is the first problem I've had in front of me in years that's the right size for what I can actually do. And because someone helped Alderman put me out of my position in town, and I'd like to know why. She looked at him. And because I think what's being done to your ranch is wrong. And I'm close enough to see it clearly. He nodded, not warmly, but with something that might have been, in a man who'd been alone on this land for a long time, the beginning of something resembling respect. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. Tell me about Pryor, he said. She did. Henry Pryor lived 30 miles east on a piece of land that looked like it had been apologizing for itself for years. The fences were standing, but only just, and the small herd visible from the road was thin enough that Eliza felt a cold recognition looking at them. The same thinness she'd been fighting on the Rourke property, the same specific look of animals that had been losing a slow war against conditions engineered to defeat them. She had ridden out with Caleb on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after Tom Garrett's visit to the ranch. The road was frozen hard and the sky was the flat, non-committal white of a Montana December threatening weather it hadn't committed to yet. Caleb rode beside her without talking for most of it, which she had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply the way he occupied space when he was thinking. She had stopped trying to fill his silences. It had taken her 10 days to stop trying, but she'd managed it. Pryor came to his door before they reached the porch. He was a small man, older than Caleb by maybe 15 years, with the dried-out look of someone who'd been worried for too long. He looked at Caleb first, and then at Eliza, and the look he gave her was not dismissive. It was more the look of a man who had learned to be careful about everyone. "Rourke," he said. "Been a while." "It has." Caleb dismounted. "This is Eliza Whitmore. She's working the ranch with me." Pryor nodded at her without elaborating on what he thought of that. "Come inside. It's cold." The inside of Pryor's house was warmer than the outside and not much else. It was clean in the way that places kept by people with very little become clean. Everything used until it was used up. Nothing extra, nothing decorative. He put coffee on and they sat at his table, and Caleb looked at Eliza in a way that meant he expected her to do the talking, which she did. She laid it out plainly. The grazing rights agreement, the maintenance clause, the addendum with its carefully vague standards, the feed disruption, the hand poaching, the redirected supplements, Garrett's visit and his surveying eyes. She put it in front of Pryor the way you put evidence in front of someone who already knows the shape of what you're describing and is waiting to see whether you've understood it correctly. When she finished, Pryor was quiet for a while. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The water rights," he said finally. 3 years ago." "Tell me." He told them. It took a while, and it was not a comfortable story. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was small and methodical and patient. The same way everything Alderman did was small and methodical and patient. Pryor had signed an agreement allowing a water access easement through his property during a drought year when the cash offer had seemed like the difference between making it through the season and not making it. The agreement had a clause about property upkeep, similar to the one in Caleb's grazing contract. A year later, after a series of disruptions that Pryor described in the same sequence Eliza recognized, feed trouble, a hand or two leaving, small problems compounding, an assessor had appeared and documented that the property was in violation of the upkeep standards. Aldermen had exercised the clause. The easement had become a permanent water access right, and the compensation had been renegotiated down to almost nothing. "I went to the county land office," Pryor said. "The man there looked at the paperwork and told me it was valid." "Which man?" Eliza said. "Fellow named Carver, Gerald Carver. He's been the county recorder for 6 years, Caleb said quietly. "He's been there 6 years. Pryor looked at him. "You know him." "He processed the grazing agreement." Caleb set his cup down. "I remember thinking his office got the paperwork filed fast. Same week I signed." Eliza felt something settle into place in her mind. One of those moments where a picture you've been building adds a piece that clarifies not just one section, but the whole shape of what you're looking at. Carver, in the land office. Agreements moving fast, recorded properly, with language that looked standard but wasn't. An assessor who appeared on cue, a pattern that had worked once and was now being applied again. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "the original water rights agreement, do you still have it?" He got up without a word and went to a back room. They could hear him moving things. He came back with a wooden box, not unlike the one Caleb kept, and he put it on the table and opened it and found the agreement in less than a minute, which told her it was something he'd looked at more than once, something he'd been sitting with. She read it. The language in the maintenance addendum was not identical to the one in Caleb's contract, but it was close enough that she would have bet money they'd been drafted by the same person. The specific standards, the vague language, the way the clause was buried in the second page where a man in a tight season signing fast might not read it carefully enough. "Have you spoken to anyone else about this?" she asked. "Who would I speak to?" He said it without bitterness, just fact. "I don't have money for a lawyer. The land office already told me it was valid. Alderman's got friends on the county council." "Does he have friends everywhere?" she asked. Pryor thought about that. "Not the bank in Billings," he said. "The main branch. The manager there, fellow named McAllister, had a run-in with Alderman about 5 years back. Something about a loan Alderman tried to call in early on a property that turned out not to qualify. McAllister's not friendly to him." He paused. "And there's Judge Hartley up in the circuit court. He doesn't like Carver. Everybody knows it, though nobody says why. Something that happened before my time." Eliza looked at Caleb. He was looking back at her with the expression she'd learned to read as him working through something he was about to decide. "The contracts," she said, "might not be the whole strategy. They're the legal mechanism, but Alderman needs the property to look like it's in violation before he can invoke them. Which means if we can document that the decline was engineered, but the feed disruption, the supplement diversion, the hand poaching, we have grounds to challenge the assessment, even if we can't challenge the contract itself. Documentation, Caleb said. The invoices. The supplement receipts showing payment for goods that were never used. The timing of the feed supplier's term change relative to Alderman's other moves. She turned back to Pryor. And testimony from you, if you're willing, about the same pattern on your property. The silence that followed was the kind where you could hear the weight of what was being asked. Pryor was a small man on a shrinking piece of land with no money for lawyers and a county recorder who had already told him he'd lost. She was asking him to stand up in a room and say that the most powerful man in the county had systematically cheated him. She understood what that cost. I'm not telling you it's safe, she said. I'm telling you it might be the only thing that actually works. He looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the box with the contract in it. He looked at Caleb, who was sitting across the table doing what Caleb did best, which was say nothing at the moment when it mattered that someone say nothing. Tell me what you need, Pryor said. They rode home in the late afternoon with the light going fast and the temperature dropping in the way that made the air feel like a warning. Caleb was quiet for the first several miles in his thinking way, and Eliza let him be. You believe Pryor, he said eventually. Not a question exactly. Yes, the contracts are too similar for coincidence, and the pattern is identical. This is Alderman's method. She paused. I think he's done it to at least 2 other properties, maybe more. People who signed something in a desperate season and then found themselves without the thing they needed. Water, land, whatever it is a man can't do without. Yes. More silence. The horse's breath came in clouds in the cold air. What you said to Pryor, Caleb said, about documenting that the decline was engineered. That's going to be hard to prove. I know. The men who diverted the supplements, they're working for Alderman now. They're not going to admit to anything. I know that too. She had been thinking about it since they'd left Pryor's. But there's a difference between proving something in court and making it publicly clear enough that it can't be ignored. If we can show the timing, the sequence of events, who benefited, what happened right after each step, a judge who's already skeptical of Carver's office might be willing to look hard at the underlying agreements. Might, Caleb said. Yes. Might. She didn't soften it. I'm not going to tell you this is certain. I don't know that it is. He nodded. That was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't punish people for telling him hard truths. He absorbed them and went on. It was one of the things she'd come to respect about him, quietly, in the same way she'd come to respect the way he repaired things himself before asking anyone else to, and the way he never complained about the cold even when she could see it was getting to him, and the way he'd repaired the 4th section of fence without being asked while she was doing the 3rd. I'll write down everything I remember about the men who left, he said. The dates, what they said when they went, what changed after. That would help, she said. The storm came 4 days later, and it came the way the worst ones do, faster than the sky had suggested, bigger than the clouds had threatened, arriving in the night with the kind of wind that found every gap in a structure and made itself known through it. Eliza woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of the barn taking the weather badly, a sound she'd learned to distinguish from ordinary wind noise in her weeks on the property, a specific stressed complaint from the north wall that she'd noted was the weakest section. She was dressed and outside before she'd fully decided to be, which was how she'd operated most of her life. The cold was absolute. The snow was horizontal in the wind. She got the barn door open against the resistance of the gusting air and pushed inside to find the horses disturbed and 2 of the 3 milk cows on the wrong side of the interior gate, which meant something had given way somewhere. She spent the next hour in the barn getting the animals settled, fixing the broken interior latch with a length of wire and a bolt she found in the tool storage, and trying not to think about the fact that the north wall was making a sound that was getting worse. Caleb appeared at the barn door at 3, pulling on his coat, his hair pushed sideways by the wind. The cattle, he said. Barn is holding, but the north wall is stressed. The cattle, north pasture, he said. I need to check the shelter. I'm coming. You don't need to. I know the north fence line better than you do right now, she said. I fixed 3 sections of it. I know where the weak points are. He didn't argue. They went out together into the storm. The north pasture was a different world in the blizzard. The wind erased distances, made familiar ground unfamiliar, took the landmark of the fence line and reduced it to a dark shape appearing and disappearing in the white. The cattle were bunched near the emergency shelter, which was holding, but the far side of the shelter showed a gap where the planking had pulled away from the frame and the wind was getting through to the animals on that end. Caleb found the problem, and she found the repair materials shouting over the wind so they didn't have to keep covering the distance between them, working in the way that people work in emergencies when they have stopped caring about pride or protocol and are just doing what needs doing. Her hands were past cold, into the numb territory where she could feel pressure but not temperature. She worked by feel and by what she knew about the structure from having looked at it twice during her property surveys. They got the gap closed. Not perfectly. It would need proper repair in daylight, but closed enough that the wind was no longer coming through to the animals, and the cattle that had been pressed to the far end began to settle. On the way back to the house, fighting the wind, she stepped wrong in the dark and went down hard, one knee into the frozen ground, and the pain was sharp and immediate, and she made a sound she hadn't planned to make. Caleb was beside her before she'd processed that she'd fallen, and his hand was on her arm, steadying her back up, and he held on a moment after she was upright, which was longer than strictly necessary. "All right," he said. "Fine," she said, which was not entirely true. Her knee was going to be ugly by morning. "Let's go in." He didn't let go of her arm until they reached the porch. The storm lasted 2 full days, the roads were impassable, the sky was gray and total, and the world shrank to the property and the people on it. Caleb and Eliza worked the barn rotations in shifts, checking the cattle every 4 hours, keeping the stove going, managing the diminished but surviving situation of the ranch through the worst of it. They ate at the same table and spoke in the shorthand that develops between people who have been working through a crisis together. Not warm exactly, not the kind of comfortable that comes with time, but the kind of direct and unguarded that comes with shared difficulty. On the second night of the storm, somewhere around 8 o'clock, Caleb said, "Tell me why your father did what he did." She looked up from the papers she'd been going over. She put her pen down. "I don't know the full shape of it," she said, "but I think Alderman needed me out of the feed store. I had access to information there, supplier relationships, customer accounts, the pattern of who was buying what and when. If I was paying attention, and I was paying attention, I might have eventually noticed the pattern of what he was doing to your supply lines." She paused. "My father is a man who values his standing in town above most things. Alderman would have offered him something, or threatened something, or both. My father wouldn't have needed to know the details. He just needed a reason that fit what he already believed. Which was that I was a liability." She said it without much inflection. "That I embarrassed him by existing in a form he hadn't planned for." Caleb was quiet. The stove worked. The storm pressed against the windows. "The thing about men like your father," he said slowly, "is that they've made their calculations so many times that the calculating feels like the right thing to do, like it's just being realistic." She looked at him. It was the most he'd said about something personal in 3 weeks. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." He looked at the table. "I've done that, not the same way, but judging by what seemed realistic, what seemed obvious." He didn't look at her. "It's not a defense, I just think I understand the mechanism." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What did you decide when you did that? The times you were calculating?" "Usually the wrong thing." He got up and poured more coffee. "Not always, but often enough." She thought about telling him she'd noticed. She thought about telling him she didn't hold it against him. She decided both of those things would embarrass him and serve no useful purpose, so she said, "The billings order is going to last us through February if we're careful. After the storm, we should check the north wall of the barn for structural damage before it gets any worse." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. He sat back down. They went back to the papers. But something in the air of the kitchen had shifted. In the small way things shift when two people have said something honest and neither of them made it worse by pressing on it. The road to town was passable by the third morning after the storm, and Eliza needed to go. She had a letter to write, and it needed to go through the postal office, and she had 2 stops she hadn't told Caleb about yet. The first was to the county records office, not to speak to Carver, whose involvement in Alderman's scheme she was now treating as established, but to request the public registry of land agreements filed in the past 7 years. It was public information. Anyone could request it. She requested it, paid the small filing fee, and arranged to collect the copies in 2 days. The second stop was the telegraph office. She sent a message to a name she'd found in one of the agricultural trade circulars she'd held onto from her time at Harlan's. A land attorney in Helena who had been cited in a case involving disputed water rights in Mager County 3 years back. The message was brief. She described the pattern she'd documented, the contract language, the county recorder's involvement, the 2 affected properties. She asked whether any of it constituted grounds for a challenge, and whether there were other properties that might form a collective case. She did not tell Caleb about either stop until that evening, when she laid it out in the same way she laid everything out, plainly, without dressing it up. He listened. He asked 2 questions. He didn't tell her she'd overstepped, which she had been prepared for. "Helena is a long way for a lawyer to come," he said. "If there are other properties involved, it becomes worth his while. Cases like this are how attorneys build reputations." She looked at him, and if Alderman has been running this scheme for years with a cooperative county recorder, the exposure for everyone involved goes beyond 1 or 2 ranch agreements. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands the way Pryor had turned his. The same gesture, the same man's way of working through something he hadn't resolved. "What does your father have to do with the Helena attorney?" he asked. "Nothing, not yet." She paused. "But if I can show that Alderman used my removal from the feed store as a strategic move, not just as a favor to my father, but as something that served his operation, then my father becomes part of the documented pattern, which means he either cooperates or he's named as a participant." Caleb looked up. "That's a hard thing," he said, "using your father as leverage." "I'm not using him as leverage. I'm documenting what happened." She held his look. "There's a difference. I'm not going to threaten him or push him. But if an attorney looks at the sequence of events and sees my removal from the feed store as one step in a scheme, then that's what it is. I didn't put my father in that position. Alderman did." A long silence. "You've thought about this a lot," Caleb said. "I've thought about almost nothing else for 3 weeks." He nodded. "All right." The reply from Helena came faster than she expected. 5 days after she sent the telegram, while the snow was still thick on the ground and the roads were a negotiation rather than a certainty. The attorney's name was James Aldrich, and his reply was careful and precise and ran to 2 pages, which told her he had taken it seriously. He had, he wrote, handled 2 cases in the past 4 years involving contract language substantially similar to what she'd described. One had settled out of court. One was still pending. He had been trying, in both cases, to establish a pattern of predatory practice across multiple properties, which was difficult with 2 cases and would be considerably less difficult with 3 or 4. He would be willing to travel to the county if there was sufficient basis for a consolidated challenge. He requested copies of the contracts, the invoices, and any documented evidence of the external disruption she had described. He noted, in a final paragraph she read twice, that if the county recorder could be shown to have facilitated an irregular filing practice that benefited one party in multiple transactions, the exposure for that official extended well beyond civil liability. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her, and she watched his face as he read it. When he finished, he put it down. "He thinks there's something here," he said. "He thinks there's enough to look at." She was careful. "That's not the same as winning, but it's a start. If Alderman finds out we've contacted a Helena attorney, he'll try to move faster on the contract clause." Yes, she had thought about this, which is why we need to be further ahead than we currently are before he finds out. We need the documentation in order. We need Pryor formally on board, and we need to know whether there are other properties. The registry copies. "I pick them up tomorrow." Caleb looked at the letter again. He looked out the window at the snow-covered property. His father's fence line out there somewhere under the white, the north pasture shelter they'd repaired in the storm, the barn with its damaged north wall that they'd shored up and would need to fix properly when the ground allowed. 18 years on this land, his father's post still holding wire. "I want to ride out to Pryor this week," he said. "Tell him about Aldrich myself." "He'll want to hear it from you," she agreed. Caleb folded the letter carefully and set it beside the box of invoices and contracts that had been growing on the kitchen table for weeks. The accumulating record of everything Alderman had done, laid out in paper and dates and amounts that told the story whether anyone wanted it told or not. "There's something I haven't told you," he said. She waited. 6 months ago, Alderman made me a direct offer. In person, he rode out here, sat in this kitchen, and offered me a price for the property. Caleb looked at his hands. "It was a fair price, maybe more than fair, for a ranch that was already in trouble. But you didn't take it." "I told him I'd think about it." He paused. He left smiling, like he already knew what the answer was going to be. And then the hands left. "Within 3 weeks. He looked up. "I didn't connect it at the time. I thought it was coincidence. The men were having trouble with their wages, and I was already behind on the supplier." He stopped. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man who is too close to the problem to see the shape of it," she said. "That's not a failure. That's just how close problems work." He was quiet. Then, "He knew I'd say no. He wasn't offering to buy. He was documenting that he'd offered, in case he needed it later." She felt the cold clarity of that. A reasonable offer on the table that you declined. Which means later, when his documentation shows the property declining, he can say he tried to help. He gave you a way out and you refused it. And then the place fell apart anyway. Caleb's voice was flat. That's the story he'd tell. Yes. She looked at the letter from Aldrich, which is also why we need to show that the falling apart didn't happen by itself. She went to get the registry copies the following morning, riding in alone because Caleb was managing a cattle check and because she wanted to do this particular errand without him. Not for secrecy, she told him where she was going, but because what she was looking for in those registry pages was something she wanted to see with her own eyes first before she described it to anyone. She was right. There were 4 properties in the county registry with agreements filed through Carver's office in the past 6 years that used substantially similar language to Caleb's contract. 4. She sat in the records office with the copies in her hands and read each one, and the pattern was as clear and cold as the air outside. Same structure, same maintenance addendum, same clause buried on the second page. Filed within days of being signed, which was fast, unusually fast, she now understood, for a county recorder's office that was otherwise slow about everything. 2 of the properties had subsequent filing notes that told the story in bureaucratic language. Revised terms, extended rights, renegotiated compensation. The mechanism had already fired on 2 of the 4. The other 2, including Caleb's, were still in the setup phase. She made copies of everything she was legally allowed to copy, paid the fees, and rode back to the ranch. That evening, she laid it all on the table. 4 properties, 2 already lost, the registry evidence of a pattern, the attorney in Helena who had 2 other cases and was looking for a third. Caleb sat across from her and looked at it all and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who are the other 2? The ones that haven't gone yet?" She showed him. He looked at the names. He recognized one of them, a man named Gus Fellows, who ran a small mixed operation 15 miles to the north. "Fellows doesn't know," Caleb said. "Almost certainly not. We need to tell him." "Yes," she said. "We do." He looked at her across the table. She had been on his property for 5 weeks. His herd was beginning to recover. The fence was repaired. The barn wall was shored up. The feed was coming in on schedule from Billings. He had a letter from an attorney in Helena on the table, a box of documented evidence beside it, and a county registry showing that what was being done to him was being done to other men with the same instrument. "You said when you arrived that you'd run out of other doors," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you ran out," he said. "I want you to know that, whatever happens with the rest of this." She looked at him. He said things like that with the same directness he applied to everything. No embroidery, no softening, just the fact of it, offered plainly. "So am I," she said. Outside, the cold had settled in for the night, and the land was quiet under its snow. And somewhere 30 miles to the west, Wade Alderman was in his large, well-heated house, confident and patient, unaware that the papers on this kitchen table had just become the most dangerous thing in the county. Gus Fellows was not an easy man to convince of anything, which Caleb had warned her about on the ride over, and which became apparent within the first 5 minutes of sitting in his kitchen. He was a wide, square-built man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by bad news a long time ago and had arrived somewhere beyond surprise into a kind of permanent, weathered skepticism. He listened to everything Eliza laid out, the contracts, the pattern, the registry copies, the other properties, without interrupting, which she initially took as a good sign and then realized was not engagement, but suspension. He was waiting for the part where it stopped making sense. "You're telling me," he said when she finished, "that Wade Alderman has been running the same scheme on 4 properties in this county, and nobody has done anything about it. The 2 properties where it's already resolved, those men signed revised agreements rather than fight it. They probably thought they had no grounds and no resources." "They were right about the resources," Fellows said. He looked at Caleb. "No offense to your woman here, but a letter from a Helena attorney isn't the same as a Helena attorney standing in front of a judge." "She's not my woman," Caleb said in the tone of someone correcting a factual error rather than making a point. "She's right about the pattern. I've looked at all of it." Fellows picked up the copy of his own contract that Eliza had brought, the one from the registry, with the maintenance clause on the second page, and read through it with the expression of a man reading something he'd signed without reading carefully enough the first time. She watched him find the clause. She watched his face. "I signed this in June," he said. "Alderman's man came out, said it was a standard access agreement for the creek boundary." "The creek boundary," Eliza said. "He needs the water access." "He's got water access on his own property. He needs yours too, for the eastern expansion. If he owns or controls the creek access on your property and Caleb's water easement, he controls irrigation rights for about 4,000 additional acres." She let him sit with that. "It's not about any one property. It's about building a water network across the whole east side of the county." Fellows was quiet. He put the contract down and looked at it on the table like it was something he'd found in his house that he didn't remember bringing in. "My feed supplier changed terms on me 2 months ago," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "I checked the billings registry on my way through last week. Your account was flagged for the same cash-on-delivery requirement as Caleb's, same month, different week." Fellows looked at her. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly since she'd walked in, and the look was different from before. Not warm, but focused. The look of a man recalibrating. "How did you check the billings registry?" he said. "I asked them to pull accounts flagged for term changes in the county in the past 6 months. It's commercial information. Any account holder can request it for their own account. But if you know someone at the office who understands pattern inquiries..." She stopped. "I know someone. I'm careful about what I ask for and how." He looked at Caleb again. "She's done this before." "No," Caleb said. "She's doing it as she goes." Fellows picked up his coffee. He put it down without drinking it. He rubbed his face with both hands in the gesture of a man who is moving from one understanding of his situation to a different and less comfortable one. If I go to this Helena attorney with you, and it doesn't work," he said, "Alderman will know I tried. He'll accelerate whatever he's planning." "Yes," Eliza said, "he will." "So I'm choosing between getting taken slow and quiet or getting taken fast and loud." "Or not getting taken at all," she said. "That's the third option. It requires the attorney, the documentation, and more than 2 of us." "More than 2, he repeated. "Who else?" "Pryor is in. There are 2 other properties in the registry with the same contract language. One of them I haven't contacted yet. And there's a man at the Billings Bank, a manager named McAllister, who has his own reasons to be interested in Alderman's financial practices." She paused. "And Judge Hartley, on the circuit court." "Hartley doesn't like Carver," Fellows said slowly. I know. I'd like to understand why before I approach anything near that. Fellows was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was cold in the corners, warm near the stove, the usual uneven temperature of a house that heated itself as best it could and no better. Outside, the light was the low, thin light of a December afternoon. My wife, he said, has been telling me since August that something was wrong, that the way things were going didn't feel right. He looked at his hands. I told her she was worried over nothing. Eliza said nothing. Caleb said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing was to let a man finish thinking out loud. I'll join you, Fellows said. What do you need from me? What she needed from him was time, access to his records, and a willingness to make a difficult ride to the fourth property on the registry list. A man named Walt Dubois, who ran cattle and a small timber operation 35 miles north. She needed all of it in the next 10 days, before Alderman had any reason to suspect that the quiet operation he'd been running on 4 separate fronts had suddenly become a coordinated problem. She had 10 days. She thought she had 10 days. She was wrong by about 4. On the 6th day after the visit to Fellows, Tom Garrett rode through the Rourke gate again. This time she was in the barn and saw him coming from the small window above the tool storage, and she watched him for a moment before she went out. The way he rode, the pace of it, told her something before he opened his mouth. He was moving like a man delivering a message that had a deadline attached. Caleb came out from the house, and she came out from the barn, and they both reached the yard at approximately the same time. Garrett looked between them without apparent surprise that she was still there. Mr. Alderman would like to schedule that meeting, Garrett said, about the grazing agreement terms. He sent you to schedule a meeting twice now, Caleb said. He could write a letter. Mr. Alderman prefers to handle these things in person. He'd like to come out to the property next week. Garrett's eyes moved in their survey way, cataloging the yard, the barn, the visible fence line. She saw him notice the things that had been repaired. She saw him notice the things that hadn't been yet. At your convenience, of course. He wants to see the property, Eliza said. Garrett looked at her. The same flat assessment as always, and beneath it the same small recalculation she'd seen the first time. It's a social call, he said. It's an assessment visit, she said. He wants to see whether the operation qualifies for the clause trigger in the maintenance addendum. He wants to see it before we've had time to repair more. A pause. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. She had said, out loud, what both of them were doing there, and it had landed differently than he'd expected. I'll tell Mr. Rourke you'll be in touch, Caleb said, when he's ready to write a letter. Garrett looked at him. Then he turned his horse and rode out. She and Caleb stood in the yard for a moment after the sound of the hooves faded. He's going to tell Alderman what you said, Caleb said. I know. Which means Alderman knows we understand the mechanism. He suspected it already. Tom Garrett has been watching this property closely enough that Alderman knows what's been repaired. He's been adjusting his timeline. Caleb turned to look at her. How much time do we have before he acts on the clause? I don't know. Less than I thought. She was already thinking through the sequence. I need to contact Aldrich and Helena today, and we need to reach Dubois before the end of the week. She sent the telegraph to Aldrich that afternoon, a longer message than she'd sent before, detailing the 4 properties, the registry evidence. Pryor and Fellow is confirmed, Dubois still to be contacted, and Garrett's visit with its implicit acceleration. She asked for a response within 48 hours on whether Aldrich would travel and on what basis. Aldrich's response came in 36 hours. He would travel. He needed the original contracts, not copies. He would need the property owners to bring them, or to grant him written access to retrieve them. He had a colleague, a man named Potts, who had been working the Mager County water rights case and had documentation that connected to the same pattern. He believed that with 4 properties and the registry evidence, there was a basis for a petition to the circuit court to freeze any existing agreements pending investigation. Freeze. The word mattered. It meant Alderman couldn't act on the clause while the petition was before the court. She read the response twice and then went to find Caleb. He was at the north fence line, the one his father had built, doing a repair on a post that had shifted in the freeze. He was working with the focused, economical movements of a man who had done physical work his whole life and didn't need to think about it. She came up beside him and handed him the telegram. He read it. He kept holding the post in one hand while he read, which struck her for some reason. The ordinary task and the consequential paper held in the same hands at the same time. Potts in Meagher County, he said. Alderman's operation extends further than just this county, apparently. Or the same method was used somewhere else first. He's been doing this for a long time. Long enough that there are 2 attorneys who've been trying to build a case without quite enough properties to make it stick. She took the telegram back. We're the third spoke on the wheel. With 4 properties here and whatever Potts has in Meagher, there's a pattern that a circuit court judge can't call coincidence. Caleb drove the post and stood up. He looked down the fence line, the repaired sections, the original wire that had been here since his father strung it. She had spent enough time on this property now to understand what it represented to him. Not sentimentally, but practically. A continuity. A thing built over time that was worth defending precisely because it hadn't been easy. I'll go to Dubois, he said, alone. I can make better time and it'll be less, and it won't look like an organized approach. One neighbor talking to another. That's smart. She paused. Take the registry copy of his contract. I know. He picked up his tools. What are you going to do while I'm gone? Go through everything we have and organize it in the order a lawyer needs it. And she stopped. And I need to speak to someone in town. She said it carefully. About my father. Caleb looked at her. He didn't ask the question. I've been working around it, she said. But if Aldrich is building a complete account of how the scheme operated, my removal from the feed store is part of it. The sequencing. I need to know what my father was offered or threatened with, and I need to know whether he understood what he was participating in or whether he was used without fully knowing. Does it matter for the case? It matters for the case if he's willing to talk to Aldrich. It matters for other reasons besides the case. She met his look. I'm not doing it for him. I want to be clear about that. I stopped expecting things from him a long time ago, but he's a thread in this, and I need to know where the thread leads. She rode into Grady's Bend the following morning for the first time since the day she'd left for the Rourke Ranch. The town looked the same. It always looked the same, which was one of the things she had once found comforting and now found merely factual. She went first to the post office to collect Aldrich's formal correspondence, which had followed the telegram. Then she went to the one place she knew her father would be on a Thursday morning. Dale Whitmore's office was above the hardware store. He had run a small land brokerage for 15 years, selling parcels, handling transfers, doing the quiet bureaucratic work that held property transactions together in a county where the county recorder's office was the official organ and Dale's brokerage was the unofficial one. She had understood the shape of this for years without thinking through its implications. She was thinking through them now, climbing the stairs to his office. He was at his desk when she came through the door. He looked up and his face went through 3 expressions in fast succession: surprise, discomfort, and then the default setting of a man who had decided that authority was the correct posture. Eliza. He put down his pen. I didn't expect... I know you didn't. She closed the door behind her. She sat down across from him without being invited, which she could see registered on him. I need to talk to you about Wade Alderman. A pause, a very specific kind of pause. I don't know what you think you know, he said. I know that he spoke to you before you came to Harlan's. I know that my removal from that position served his interests in a specific way. It removed someone with supplier knowledge and pattern access from a position where she might notice what he was doing to Caleb Rourke's supply lines. She watched his face. What I don't know is what he offered you, or what he threatened, or how much you understood about what you were being used for. Her father's face was doing something complicated. He had, she realized, not expected to be on the receiving end of this kind of organized thinking from his daughter. He had a fixed image of her that he had been maintaining for 26 years, and it was encountering new information that the image didn't accommodate. He's a business associate, Dale said finally. He asked me a favor. What favor exactly? He said you'd been talking at the feed store about his supplier relationships. Said it was proprietary business information and it was creating difficulties for him. Dale's voice had the particular quality of a man reciting a version of events that he'd practiced. I was doing him a professional courtesy. He told you I was sharing proprietary information. She kept her voice level. And you believed him. I had no reason not to. You had 26 years of knowing me, she said, which should have been a reason to ask me first. She held his look. What did he offer you? Eliza, Papa. She hadn't called him that in months, and the word came out with something complicated in it that she hadn't planned. I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm here because there's an attorney from Helena who is building a case against Wade Alderman for a pattern of predatory contract practices across multiple properties, and your name is going to come up in that case whether or not you talk to me today. I would rather you understand what's happening before it happens. He was very still. Outside his window, the sounds of Grady's Bend's midday traffic moved past, ordinary and indifferent. What kind of case? He said. His voice had changed. She told him. Not everything. She wasn't going to lay the full architecture in front of him without knowing where he stood, but enough. The 4 properties. The registry evidence, Carver's office, and the fast filings. The 2 attorneys from outside the county who had been trying to establish exactly this pattern. As she talked, she watched something happen to her father's face that she hadn't expected to see there. He was not, she realized, the kind of man who had knowingly participated in fraud. He was the kind of man who had accepted a convenient story about his daughter because it aligned with things he already believed, and done a favor for a powerful acquaintance without asking too many questions. That was its own kind of failure, a significant one, the kind she had spent her life on the receiving end of, but it was not the same as knowing. He told me you were discussing his accounts, Dale said slowly. I thought it was a business matter. He stopped. What does the attorney need? An account of the conversation Alderman had with you, what he asked, what he said, what he offered. He offered me the listing for 3 parcels he was planning to sell in the spring. Exclusive listing, commission attached. He said it the way people say things they know sound worse out loud than they did at the time. I didn't think it was. You didn't ask, she said. I know. He looked at her, the complicated face again, and underneath the complexity something she hadn't looked for from him in a long time. Not quite remorse, but the near relative of it. The expression of a man who has been presented with the actual shape of a thing he told himself was something else. Would it help the case, he said, if I spoke to the attorney? Yes, she said, considerably. He nodded. He looked at his desk, at the pen he'd put down when she came in. Your mother would have. He stopped. He started again. You've been out at the Rourke Ranch all this time. Yes. Is it? He seemed uncertain what he was actually asking. Are you all right out there? She thought about the barn in the storm, the frozen ground under her knee, the kitchen table covered in documents that might determine whether 4 men kept their land. Coffee in the mornings, the flue damper that stuck to the left, the particular silence of a man who'd stopped waiting for her to fail. Yes, she said. I am. She rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon with her father's agreement to speak with Aldrich and a strange, unresolved feeling that she carried in her chest the whole ride back. She had not forgiven him. She wasn't sure what forgiving him would even mean in practical terms, whether it was a decision or a process or just a thing that happened over time without announcement. But she had seen something in him today that she hadn't been looking for, and it sat in her differently than she'd expected. Caleb was back from Dubois when she returned. He was in the barn, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders when she came through the door that the Dubois visit had gone a specific way. He's in, Caleb said, before she could ask. He already knew something was wrong. His water was restricted last fall, something with an upstream agreement he'd signed. He didn't know it connected to anything else. He turned around. He was angry, the kind of angry that doesn't go anywhere useful until someone gives it a direction. Now he has a direction. Yes. Caleb leaned against the barn wall. How was your father? She told him. He listened with the same focused attention he brought to everything that mattered, not interrupting, watching her face. He didn't know, Caleb said when she finished. Not fully. He knew enough to ask fewer questions than he should have. She paused. He's going to talk to Aldrich. That takes courage. For a man like him. It takes self-interest, she said. If Alderman goes down, my father needs to be on the right side of the record. That's what he's thinking. Maybe. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Doesn't mean the courage isn't also there. She looked at him. He said that kind of thing occasionally, something that cut through what she'd decided to think about a situation and offered a different angle, not an argument, just an observation. She had learned to let those observations sit rather than argue with them. Aldrich arrived in Grady's Bend 10 days later, which was faster than she'd dared to plan for. He came with Potts, the Meagher County attorney, and the two of them together in the back room of the town's one small hotel made the whole enterprise feel different. Real, in a way that a stack of papers on a ranch kitchen table was real, but an attorney in the room was real differently. Aldrich was a thin man in his 40s with a precise manner and the habit of writing things down the moment they were said to him, which she respected. Potts was older, slower to speak, with the kind of patience that came from years of working cases that didn't resolve fast. Between them, over 2 days, they assembled the consolidated documentation. She sat with them both days. She had organized everything in the order she'd told Caleb she would, chronological within each property, cross-referenced by date to show the pattern, the registry copies indexed and tabbed. Aldrich looked at her organization and then looked at her and said, without editorializing, "You've done this before." "No," she said, "but I understand structure." Pryor came in on the first day, Fellows on the second, Dubois on the second afternoon, still carrying the anger she'd heard described, though it had gone quieter and more focused in the weeks since Caleb's visit. Her father came on the second morning, sat with Aldrich for 2 hours, and came out looking like a man who had put something down after carrying it for a while. He stopped in the hallway where she was waiting. "I told him everything," Dale said. "The full conversation. What Alderman said, what he offered, the timing." He looked at the floor, then at her. "I named him specifically, in the written statement." "All right," she said. "I know it doesn't—" He stopped. "I know it doesn't fix what I did." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He nodded. He went out. The petition to the circuit court went in on a Friday. Aldrich had moved faster than she'd thought possible, which he explained was because the Meagher County documentation gave them a prior pattern that strengthened the current property's case considerably. The petition requested an immediate freeze on all existing agreements between Wade Alderman and the 4 named property owners pending investigation into the validity of the contract terms and the conduct of the county recorder's office. Judge Hartley granted the freeze within 3 days. She was at the ranch when the word came back through Aldrich's telegram. She read it at the kitchen table. The stove was going, the coffee was on, and outside the snow was coming down steadily in the way it had been for a week, the ordinary Montana winter doing its ordinary Montana work. Caleb came in from outside, stomping snow from his boots, and she handed him the telegram. He read it standing by the door, coat still on, snow melting off his shoulders. He read it twice. He put it down on the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. She understood. There was a difference between working towards something and having the first real confirmation that the working was doing something, and the difference was not a small one, and some things were better absorbed quietly. Hartley granted it, he said finally. "Yes. That means Alderman can't act on the clause while the investigation is open. He can't do anything with any of the 4 properties. No new assessments, no revised terms, no enforcement actions." She paused. "He's going to try to find another way." "I know." Caleb sat down. He put both hands flat on the table that had held the contracts and the invoices and the registry copies and the attorney's correspondence for months. The table that had become, without planning, the center of the entire operation. What does Aldrich think comes next? He thinks Alderman's attorney will challenge the petition's scope, try to get it narrowed to 1 property rather than all 4. We need to counter that with the pattern evidence, which we have, but it takes time. She looked at him. And Carver is going to be under pressure. If he's smart, he starts cooperating with the investigation before he's compelled to. And if he's not smart, then he goes down with Alderman, and the investigation takes longer but ends in the same place. Caleb poured himself coffee. He poured a cup for her without being asked, which he'd started doing somewhere around the third week and had never stopped. He sat back down. "Garrett came by while you were in town yesterday," he said. She looked up. He didn't stop, just rode along the road at the property line and turned around. Caleb's voice was level. "Alderman knows the petition went in." He knew it was coming. He has enough contacts in the county that he would have heard. She thought about that. He's going to come at it differently now. Not the contract mechanism. That's frozen. Something else. What else does he have? Reputation. He'll try to make the case look like a coordinated attack by disgruntled parties who couldn't manage their own operations. He'll find people to say that publicly. She met Caleb's look. That's why the documentation matters. Not just for the court, for the public record, for what people in this county understand happened. "People in this county don't think much of me," Caleb said, "and they think less of you." "They thought less of me," she said, past tense. He looked at her. There was something in his face that he sometimes arrived at after a long silence. Not a decision exactly, but the expression of a man who has been working toward a decision and has gotten close enough to see its outline clearly. "The ranch is going to be all right," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something he was saying out loud because it needed to be said out loud. "Whatever happens with Alderman, the operation, what you've done with the herd, the feed, the fence, that's real. It doesn't go away regardless of what the court does. The herd is recovering. You'll have sellable weight by late spring." She paused. "That was always the first thing. Get the operation stable. Everything else depends on that." "You made it stable." "You let me," she said. "That's not a small thing, letting someone help when you're used to doing things alone." He was quiet. The kitchen was warm and the snow was coming down outside and the telegram was on the table between their cups. And this was the moment, she thought later, that she should have understood was different from other moments. But she was tired and her knees still ached from the fall and the storm, and she was thinking about Alderman's next move and she didn't understand it fully until later. What Caleb said was, "I don't want you to leave when this is over." She looked at him. "I mean," he stopped. He started again. "I want you to stay. On the ranch. Not because of the work, though the work matters. Because..." He looked at the table. He was not a man who had much practice with this particular kind of sentence. "Because this is the first time in a long time that this place has felt like something worth defending instead of just something I was trying not to lose." The stove worked. The snow came down. She looked at the man across from her who fixed his father's fence posts himself and drank his coffee strong and black, and had stopped waiting for her to fail somewhere around the middle of the fourth week and hadn't started again. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. He looked up. "I haven't been planning to leave for a while," she said. "I just didn't know when to say so." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. Outside, Wade Alderman was somewhere in his well-heated house making calculations about what came next. And in the circuit court in Helena, there was a freeze order with 4 names on it. And in the county records office, there was a recorder named Carver, who was about to have a very difficult winter. And on the kitchen table, between 2 coffee cups, the telegram from Aldrich sat in the lamplight like something that had been worth the whole long fight to get to. Gerald Carver broke on a Tuesday in February, which was not the day anyone had predicted, but was, in retrospect, the only day it could have happened. Aldrich had told them in January that Carver was the weak point, not because he was the least culpable, but because he was the most exposed. Alderman had money and attorneys and 15 years of carefully constructed goodwill in the county. Carver had a government salary, a family in Grady's Bend, and a filing practice that, under examination, was going to be very difficult to explain as anything other than what it was. When the circuit court investigator arrived at the county records office to examine the filing timestamps on 6 years of land agreements, Carver had lasted exactly 4 days before requesting a meeting with Aldrich. Eliza was not in that meeting. She was at the ranch, doing what she had been doing through all of January and into February, managing the herd, keeping the operation stable, working through the long administrative tail of the case while Caleb handled the physical work, and the two of them traded the documentation tasks the way they'd learned to trade everything else over the preceding months, without ceremony, based on who was better positioned at any given moment to do the thing that needed doing. The news came through Aldrich's telegram, which arrived on a Wednesday morning. Caleb read it at the table. He was halfway through his breakfast when it came, and he put his fork down and read it, and then pushed it across to her without a word. She read it. Carver had provided a full written account of his arrangement with Alderman. The account covered 6 years and 7 properties, 3 more than they'd identified through the registry. He had received payment in the form of a land transfer, a small parcel on the county's eastern edge, transferred quietly through a shell agreement that didn't appear in the public registry because Carver had filed it himself and had very specific reasons for keeping it quiet. He had identified the assessor Alderman had used for the property condition reports, a man named Tillis who held no official county position but was paid per assessment and whose reports, Carver confirmed, were written to reach predetermined conclusions. Tillis had been contacted by Aldrich's office the same day. He had retained his own attorney by evening. 7 properties, Caleb said. 3 more than we knew. She set the telegram down. Aldrich is going to amend the petition. How long before it goes to the full hearing? He says March, maybe April. She thought about it. Alderman's attorneys are going to fight the scope. They'll try to make each property a separate matter and argue the pattern is circumstantial. That's what they're paid to do. But Carver's statement changes the argument significantly. You can argue that 4 separate ranchers misread their own contracts. It's harder to argue that when the county recorder is explaining in writing how the scheme was administered. Caleb picked his fork back up. He finished his breakfast in silence, which wasn't the silence of a man who didn't care, but the silence of a man who was processing something large in the particular internal way he processed everything. She had learned to recognize the difference between his silences the way you learn to read weather. Each one had a specific quality, a specific temperature. My father used to say, he said eventually, that the only thing worse than losing a fight was winning one the wrong way. She looked at him. He meant it about ranching, Caleb said, about not overgrazing a pasture to beat a neighbor's yield, about not cutting corners on the herd health to get a better price in a bad year. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't think he was a complicated man, but he knew that what you did to get somewhere was the same thing you'd be standing on when you got there. She understood what he was saying, that the way the case was going, through documentation, through patience, through the careful accumulation of what had actually happened, mattered beyond the result. That Aldrich and Potts working through the legal framework properly, without shortcuts, was what made the outcome something you could stand on. He sounds like he built things to last, she said. He built the north fence in 1861, Caleb said. Some of the wire is still the original wire. She thought about that fence, the posts she'd helped repair in December, the cold going through her hands while Caleb worked the neighboring section, the wire that had been there since before either of them existed. We should replace the wire on the eastern section this spring, she said, before the thaw makes the ground soft. Caleb looked at her, the expression he sometimes arrived at after something had been said that landed exactly where it was meant to. Yes, he said, we should. The hearing was set for the 14th of March. In the 6 weeks between Carver's confession and the hearing date, Alderman made 3 moves, each of which Eliza had anticipated to some degree, and none of which landed the way he'd intended. The first was a public statement, carried in the county newspaper, in which Alderman described the consolidated petition as a coordinated legal attack by parties who had struggled to manage their own operations and were looking to blame their failures on a successful neighbor. He was careful with the language, specific enough to shape a narrative, vague enough to avoid actionable claims. He named no names. He didn't need to. She read the statement and felt the familiar weight of it. The practiced dismissal, the way a powerful man could make a group of struggling people sound like complainers without ever directly calling them that. She had been on the receiving end of that technique her entire life. She recognized it the way you recognize something that has left a mark on you. She wrote a response. Not for the newspaper, Aldrich had advised against that. but for the county council, addressed to the 3 members whose names appeared in the public record of property decisions over the past 7 years. The letter summarized, in 4 pages, the documented timeline, the agreement dates, the assessment dates, the timing of the supply disruptions relative to the agreements, Carver's position in each transaction. It was not inflammatory. It was not accusatory in tone. It was simply the sequence of events laid out in order with the documents cited by registry number. She sent it through Aldrich's office so it arrived on county council letterhead as exhibit material. 3 of the 7 properties were within the council's direct administrative jurisdiction. The council members had, by receiving the exhibit material, been officially informed. What they did with that information was their business, but they could no longer claim they didn't know. Alderman's second move was subtler. Through an intermediary she didn't initially recognize, a man who ran the livery in Grady's Bend and had no obvious connection to anything, a story began circulating that the Rourke property had been in decline long before any alleged interference, that the herd had been mismanaged for years, that the recent improvements were being exaggerated in the context of a legal dispute. She heard about it from fellows, who heard it from someone at the feed store, who had heard it from the livery man. She went to the livery. She didn't go confrontationally. She went as someone who needed her horse reshod, which was true, and she stayed while the work was done and talked to the man the way people talk in small towns when they are deciding how much to trust each other. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had done a small favor for someone he was economically connected to without thinking through what the favor was for. The story about the Rourke herd, she said near the end of the conversation, about the mismanagement. He looked at his work. I just passed along what I heard. From who? A pause. Garrett came through 2 weeks ago, talking. She nodded. She paid for the reshoeing. At the door she stopped. The herd is at 71 head, she said, up from 63 in November. If anyone asks you to pass that along, feel free. She left. She didn't know whether he would pass it along. She didn't need him to. She just needed him to understand that the story he'd been given wasn't the only story, and that the other story had numbers attached to it. Alderman's third move was the one she hadn't fully anticipated, and it came 11 days before the hearing. Tom Garrett came to the ranch for the third and final time, but this time he came alone, and he came in the morning before Caleb was back from the north pasture. And when Eliza answered the door, he didn't give her his usual assessment look. He looked instead like a man who had spent some time deciding something and had arrived at the conclusion with some discomfort. I need to speak to Rourke, he said. He'll be back within the hour. You can wait or come back. I'll wait. She led him into the kitchen because the alternative was leaving him on the porch, and that seemed like a different kind of statement than she wanted to make. She gave him coffee, and she sat across from him, and they occupied the kitchen in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. The silence of 2 people who have been on opposite sides of something and are both aware of it. You've been here since November, Garrett said finally. Yes. He turned his cup. I didn't think you'd last the first week. I know. Alderman didn't think so either. He said it without apparent calculation, more like something he'd decided to say because the careful version had become too much work. He said sending you out here would keep you occupied and away from town, and you'd be back within the month having accomplished nothing. She was very still. He knew who I was, she said. When my father, he knew Dale Whitmore had a daughter who worked at the feed store and knew the supplier network. Garrett looked at his coffee. He asked your father as a 2-purpose move. Get rid of someone who might notice what he was doing and put a dependent woman on a failing ranch so it looked even more like a lost cause. He paused. Those are his words, not mine. She sat with that for a moment. The shape of it was not surprising. She'd suspected it, had told Caleb she suspected it. But hearing it stated plainly by the man who'd been carrying it was different from suspecting it. Why are you telling me this? She said. Garrett looked at her for the first time without the assessment. Just looked at her, straight. Because I've worked for Wade Alderman for 9 years, he said, and I've done things in that time that I told myself were just business. Moving men around like pieces, delivering messages that I knew had teeth in them. He put his cup down. He asked me last week to approach one of the other property owners, fellows, and make it known that his wife's brother had a debt situation that might become public if fellows stayed in the petition. He stopped. I didn't deliver the message. You didn't? No. He looked at the table. I've been delivering messages for 9 years. That one I couldn't do. Caleb came through the door 20 minutes later, took in the situation in the kitchen in the particular fast-reading way he had, and sat down without asking for an explanation. Garrett told him what he'd told Eliza, and then he told them more. The detail of Alderman's operation as he'd observed it from inside over 9 years. Not everything would be admissible or useful, but enough of it. The specific directives he could document, the conversations he'd been present for, the Assessor Tillis's arrangement, which Garrett had managed directly, was the kind of thing that closed the remaining gaps in the case. You'd testify, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. It was him making sure of what he was hearing. If Aldrich will take a statement, Garrett said. Yes. Why now? Caleb said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Because I watched what happened out here. From November to now. I've ridden past this place more times than you know, checking on the decline, looking for signs that it was going the way it was supposed to go. He paused. And instead I watched the fence get fixed and the cattle recover and the lights on in this kitchen at 2 a.m. while somebody was going through account books. He looked at Eliza. He sent you here to fail, and you didn't fail. And I've been working for a man who does things like that for 9 years, and somewhere between November and now, I stopped being able to tell myself it was just business. She thought about what Caleb had said in December, the night of the storm, that men who calculated ended up believing the calculating was right. That the mechanism could feel like clarity when it was actually just self-serving momentum. She thought Garrett had been in that momentum for 9 years and had finally hit something that stopped it. She didn't say any of that. She got up and poured him more coffee and said, I'll wire Aldrich this afternoon. The hearing was on a Thursday. The courtroom in the circuit seat was smaller than she'd expected. A county seat building, functional rather than grand, with wooden benches and a judge's bench that looked like it had been built by someone who valued level surfaces over aesthetics. Judge Hartley was a broad man in his 60s, with the measured unhurriedness of a person who had presided over enough proceedings to know that rushing them produced bad work. All 4 property owners were present. Pryor sat beside Fellows, and Dubois sat on the other side of Caleb, and Eliza sat at the end of the row. Not at the attorney's table, because she wasn't an attorney, but near enough that Aldrich could turn and confirm a document number or a date without raising his voice. She had organized the exhibit files. She knew the order of everything. It was the most useful place for her to be. Alderman was across the room with 2 attorneys from Billings who wore better suits than anyone else in the building. He looked the same as she imagined he always looked, composed, patient, the kind of man who sat in rooms like this one with the confidence of someone who had always been able to buy his way out of them. He had not looked at her when he came in. He looked at her now. She met it steadily, and then turned back to her documents. Aldrich opened with the pattern. He did not argue each property separately. He argued the method, using the 7 properties Carver's account had confirmed, tracing the sequence on each: the contract, the filing date, the condition of the recorder's office handling, the disruptions, the assessment, the enforcement. He put it in front of Hartley the way Eliza had organized it on the kitchen table in January. Chronological within each property, cross-referenced by date, so the pattern emerged not as an assertion, but as a sequence of documented facts that happened to look identical 7 times. Alderman's attorneys argued scope. They argued that the consolidated petition improperly linked separate contractual matters. They argued that property condition assessments were the legitimate prerogative of parties to an agreement. They argued that the county recorder's personal conduct, however it might be judged, did not automatically invalidate the agreements he had processed. Hartley listened to all of it. He asked questions that were precise and unhurried. He asked Aldrich about the Assessor Tillis's relationship to the Alderman operation. He asked Alderman's attorneys about the standard filing timeline for the county recorder's office versus the timeline on the 7 agreements in question. He asked about the maintenance addendum language, whether it appeared in any other county agreements processed through Carver's office in the same period. It didn't. Aldrich had checked. The language was specific to agreements that involved Alderman as a party. Garrett testified in the afternoon session. He was not a comfortable witness. He was a man giving testimony against his former employer while fully aware of what that cost him professionally and probably personally, and it showed in the set of his shoulders and the careful, deliberate pace of his answers. But he was precise. He didn't embellish. He said what he'd seen and heard, identified when he'd been directly involved, and declined to speculate about what he hadn't directly witnessed. Alderman's attorneys went after him hard on his motivation, which was the only real avenue they had, and Garrett absorbed it without wavering, which she thought was the hardest thing she watched anyone do that day. When the cross-examination ended and Garrett stepped down, she caught his eye for a moment. She nodded. He nodded back. Hartley didn't rule from the bench that day. He recessed the hearing and said he would issue a written ruling within 30 days. It was not the immediate resolution she'd hoped for, but Aldrich had told her not to expect one. Circuit court judges didn't rule on the spot for cases with this many moving parts, and Hartley was methodical to a fault. They rode back to Grady's Bend in the late afternoon. Caleb was beside her, and Pryor and Fellows and Dubois were in a group ahead of them, and the conversation among that group was subdued but not despairing. The tone of people who had done what they came to do and were waiting for the result with the particular quality of patience that comes not from ease but from having no other option. "What do you think?" Caleb said. "I think Hartley understood what he was looking at," she said. The questions he asked were the right questions. He was looking for the pattern, not just the individual agreements. "That's not the same as ruling in our favor." "No, but it means he saw it." She paused. "Aldrich thinks we have a strong case. Potts thinks we have a stronger one than Aldrich is saying out loud, because Potts has been working the Mager case for 2 years, and he knows what this kind of documentation looks like when it's enough." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And Carver?" "He's cooperating with the investigation. Whatever deal he's working out, his cooperation is his primary asset right now. He can't afford to be anything but thorough." "Alderman's going to lose the agreements." "Yes," she said. "I think so." "And the land?" "The 2 properties where the clauses were already triggered. Those cases are more complicated. Aldrich thinks there's a path to reversal if the agreements themselves can be invalidated on the basis of how they were processed. That's harder to prove and takes longer." She looked at him. "For the remaining 4, including yours, the freeze holds while the investigation is open. Alderman can't move on the clause. And if the investigation finds what Carver's testimony suggests it will find, the agreements themselves may be voidable." Caleb absorbed this. Ahead of them, Pryor said something that made Fellows laugh, a short, surprised sound, the kind that came out of men who hadn't expected to laugh that day. "Henry Pryor hasn't laughed since I've known him," Caleb said. "He has a lot to laugh about before it's over," she said, "but some of it is already done." The ruling came in 23 days, which was faster than 30, and faster than she'd let herself expect. Aldrich sent it by telegram first, and the full document by post, and she had the telegram in her hand at the kitchen table on a morning in early April when the ground outside was beginning to remember it was capable of thaw. She read it. She read it again. Then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn. She came through the door and handed him the telegram, and he read it standing in the same posture he had had in November when she'd walked through his front door for the first time. That solid, grounded stance of a man who occupied his own space without apology. He read it twice, the same way she had. Judge Hartley had ruled that the consolidated evidence established a documented pattern of predatory contract practice facilitated by a breach of the county recorder's fiduciary duty. The maintenance addendum language in all 7 agreements was found to have been processed under conditions that rendered the filings procedurally irregular. The agreements were not automatically voided, that would require a separate proceeding, but the freeze was extended indefinitely pending that proceeding, and the court had referred the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal conduct. The State Attorney General. That was the part she hadn't expected. That was Hartley looking at what Carver had provided and deciding this was bigger than a circuit court civil matter. "He referred it up," Caleb said. "To the Attorney General." "Yes." Which means it's no longer just about the land agreements. It's a criminal investigation into Alderman's conduct across multiple counties. She let him sit with that. Aldrich is going to file for full agreement and validation in the civil proceeding. The criminal referral doesn't replace the civil case. They run parallel, but it changes Alderman's position considerably. Caleb put the telegram down on the workbench. He looked at the barn around him, the repaired north wall, the organized tool storage, the horses in their stalls. This barn that had been failing in November and was not failing now. He's not going to come after the land anymore, Caleb said. He's going to be managing a criminal investigation. His attorneys are going to be expensive and occupied. She paused. There may be civil damages. Aldrich mentioned it. For the disruption to the operations during the period of the scheme, I wouldn't count on it, but it's possible. Caleb turned and looked at her. In the 4.5 months since she'd walked through his front gate with her bag and 2 weeks of boarding house money left, she had watched his face go through changes that she hadn't expected when she'd first read the reluctant distrust in it. She had watched him become someone who asked questions before he judged, who repaired things alongside her without making it a point of pride, who said difficult truths out loud in the way of a man who had decided that honesty was more efficient than its alternatives. He wasn't an easy man. He was never going to be an easy man. He had edges that came from years of doing hard things alone, and those edges didn't sand off. They just became something you knew the shape of and worked around and sometimes ran into anyway. She had run into a few of them. He had run into some of hers. Neither of them had pretended otherwise. The spring calving starts in 3 weeks, he said. I know. We're going to need another pair of hands for it, temporary. I've been thinking about that. There's a man in Pryor's County who helped on Pryor's place last spring. Pryor mentioned him. I was going to write to him this week. Caleb nodded. Do that. He picked up the tools he'd come in for and went back out to the pasture, and she stood in the barn for a moment in the particular quiet of a place that was working the way it was supposed to work, and she thought about November. The cold porch at Harlan's, her bag at her feet, the complete and public silence of no one coming out after her. She had not been sent here as a kindness. She had been sent here as a disposal. Alderman's calculation, her father's convenience, the town's comfortable confirmation of what it had always assumed about her. She had been moved from one square to another on a board she hadn't known she was on. But the thing about being moved as a piece is that the person moving you has to believe you're only a piece, has to believe you can't see the board, can't understand the game, can't do anything but occupy the square they've placed you in. Alderman had believed that. He had built his entire calculation on it. She walked back to the house. She put the kettle on. She sat at the table that had held the contracts and the invoices, and the attorney's correspondence, and the registry copies, and the telegram from Aldrich saying the freeze had been granted, and now this telegram saying the Attorney General was involved. And she thought about what you did when someone moved you like a piece. You showed them you were a player, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation or a moment designed to demonstrate it. Just by making the next move, and the one after that, and continuing to make moves until the person who thought they were playing against empty space discovered there was someone on the other side of the board who had been there the whole time. The kettle came to a boil. She made coffee. She started the letter to Pryor's hand about the spring calving. Grady's Bend changed the way small towns change, which is to say slowly and without acknowledgement. There was no moment where the town looked at Eliza Whitmore and decided to see her differently. What there was instead was an accumulation of small adjustments, each individually deniable, that added up over the months following the hearing to something noticeably different from what had been there before. Harlan came to her in May. He came to the ranch, which took some doing. She could tell when she saw him at the gate that he'd thought about it for a while before riding out. He was a man who dealt in feed and supplies and the smallest possible amount of social complexity, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and told her that he was sorry about what had happened in November, that he hadn't known about Alderman's involvement, that he understood if she didn't believe him. I believe you didn't know the details, she said. I think you knew it was wrong and did it anyway because it was easier. He had the decency not to argue with that. I'd like you to know that if you ever need feed supplies, for the ranch, at the Billings rates, I'll match them. It's the least I can do. She thought about it. I'll let Mr. Rourke know, she said. He nodded and left. She went back inside and told Caleb, who said, Do you trust him now? I trust him to be what he is, she said. which is a man who does the right thing when it doesn't cost him much. He's useful on those terms. Caleb thought about that. Fair enough, he said. The spring calving went well, which was not a small thing. It never was. There were 3 difficult nights, one calf that needed intervention she managed with the veterinary knowledge she'd been accumulating and practicing for months, and a total that came in at 18 he had added to the herd, more than projected, more than the previous spring had given them by a significant margin. The temporary hand she'd written to turned out to be capable and quiet and good with animals, and he stayed through June before heading back north. Henry Pryor's case went before the civil court in late May for the agreement invalidation. Aldrich had prioritized his case because Pryor's water rights had been the first to be exercised. The mechanism had already fired, the damage was already done, and reversing it would demonstrate to the court that reversal was possible. The proceeding took 3 days. Hartley presided. The agreement was invalidated on the grounds of procedural irregularity in the filing, and Pryor's water access rights were restored. She heard about it from Aldrich's letter, which she read on the porch in the June evening light. She could hear Caleb in the barn, the sound of ordinary work in a place that was no longer fighting to survive, but just doing the daily work of existing. She thought about Pryor's face when she'd first seen it, the dried-out look of prolonged worry. She thought about him turning his coffee cup in his hands at his kitchen table, deciding whether the risk was worth it. He'd gotten his water back. Not easily, not without cost, not without months of uncertainty that had worn on him in ways that didn't simply resolve when the ruling came down. But he'd gotten it back. Fellows received word in July that the criminal investigation from the Attorney General's office had expanded to include 3 additional counties. Wade Alderman had retained 2 more attorneys. He had not been charged yet. These things moved the way legal machinery moved, which was thoroughly and slowly. But the expansion of the investigation meant his resources and attention were occupied in a way that left no room for the kind of patient, methodical pressure he'd been applying to the county's smaller operations. The predator had become the one being watched. The long, careful patience of his approach had been turned inside out and was now the thing being documented, the thing being examined clause by clause, filing by filing, in offices he didn't control and couldn't reach. Eliza thought about that sometimes, in the quiet way she thought about most things that mattered. The county council, in August, voted to initiate a review of all land agreements filed through Carver's office in the past 7 years. It was a political move as much as a principled one. 3 council members who had been officially informed via Aldrich's exhibit letter in February were now ensuring they were on the record as having acted. She didn't begrudge them the self-interest. They were doing the right thing partly for the wrong reasons, which was not unusual and was sometimes how the right thing got done. Carver resigned from the recorder's office in September. His replacement was a woman from the county seat who had worked in the land office in Helena and came with references that nobody connected to Alderman had provided. The summer passed in the way that summers on working ranches pass, in the relentlessness of it, the daily machinery of feeding and maintaining and managing a living operation that didn't pause for reflection or reward. There were days that were simply hard, the weather or the cattle or the equipment making demands that had nothing to do with the months of legal strategy and everything to do with the fact that working land required daily recommitment to the work. There were mornings she was tired before she started. There were evenings she sat at the kitchen table and couldn't make herself go through one more document, one more invoice, one more piece of correspondence. On one of those evenings, Caleb came in from a long day and found her at the table with her head in her hands and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he put a cup of coffee beside her and sat down and said, "What's the hardest part?" She looked up. It was the kind of question he'd gotten better at asking. Not offering solutions, not redirecting, just asking what was actually there. "The waiting," she said, "knowing we've done what we can do and now it's in other people's hands." "That part doesn't get easier," he said. "I know. You want it to, and it doesn't." He turned his cup. "But you've been better at it than you think. You've been better at most things than you think." She looked at him across the table. "You've gotten better at saying things like that." "I've had practice," he said. "You make it easier than most people. You don't make me explain myself." She thought that was one of the truest things he'd said about what had grown between them. Not that it was easy, but that it had a specific kind of honesty that didn't require translation. She didn't need him to be different from what he was. He'd stopped waiting for her to be different from what she was somewhere back in December, and they had both, without ever formally deciding to, chosen to stay. It was not a romantic story in the way that people told romantic stories. There had been no single moment of declaration, no transformation of one into what the other needed. What there had been was an accumulation. Coffee made before the other was awake, fence sections repaired without discussion, documents handed across a table, a hand steadying an arm in a frozen field, and holding on a moment longer than necessary. The ordinary material of two people building something, which was, in the end, not ordinary at all. In October, Caleb asked her to marry him at the kitchen table, which was exactly the right place for it. He said it the way he said things that mattered, without embellishment, with the particular directness of a man who had decided the careful version was too much work and honesty was more efficient. She said yes the same way, without embellishment, like a fact both of them had known for a while and were now making official. They were married in November, 1 year and 4 days after she had first walked through his front gate with her bag and 2 weeks of boarding house money. Pryor came. Fellows brought his wife, who turned out to be exactly what Eliza had expected, a sharp, warm woman who had been right about everything in August and had the particular gracious restraint of someone who didn't need to say so. Dubois came down from the north and was quieter than she remembered, but he shook Caleb's hand for a long time, and that seemed to say what he needed to say. Her father came. He stood at the back of the small gathering, and he was not comfortable, and he was not transformed, and he was not the father she'd needed him to be for 26 years. He was just a man who had driven 20 miles to watch his daughter marry on a working ranch that was alive and viable, and standing because of what she'd done there. He didn't give a speech. He didn't explain himself. He shook Caleb's hand, and he looked at Eliza with an expression that she filed carefully in the part of herself that kept difficult things at an appropriate distance. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He nodded. He didn't stay long. She didn't know, and would never fully know, what the right thing to do with her father was. Forgiveness wasn't a switch you threw. It was more like the north fence wire, something that held or didn't hold depending on the tension applied and the weather it had been through, and you checked it regularly and repaired the sections that needed repairing and accepted that some of the original wire was never coming out. He had named aldermen in a written statement. He had driven 20 miles to this. She would work with what she had, which was what she'd always done. The Rourke Ranch in the spring of the following year was a different place from the one she'd arrived at in November. Not because everything had been solved. Problems on a working ranch did not get solved, they got managed, and management was a permanent condition, not a destination. But the herd was at 87 head and growing. The barn wall was properly repaired. The eastern fence had new wire. There were 2 permanent hands now, hired carefully, paid on time. The billing supplier had become their regular account, and the terms were standard net 30, which was what they had always been entitled to and were now simply getting. The kitchen table, cleared of the months of documentation, was just a kitchen table again. She thought sometimes about what the town of Grady's Bend had expected when they'd sent her out here. A failed experiment. A confirmation of what they already believed about certain kinds of women. A story that ended the way those stories were supposed to end. With the useless girl returned, the joke completed, the existing order of things undisturbed. She thought about that less than she used to. Not because it didn't matter, it had mattered. It had shaped her. It had given her the specific and clarifying anger that had kept her at the table at 2 a.m, going through account books when she was exhausted and uncertain and far from sure it was going to work. She didn't want to lose that. She had learned to value that anger for what it was, information about the gap between what was and what should be, which was the most useful kind of information there was. But she thought about it less because the ranch was real, and the herd was real, and the cases were real, and Caleb was real, and the real things had accumulated until they outweighed the old story. That was the only way that happened, she thought. Not through a dramatic reversal, not through a moment when the world admitted it had been wrong. Just through the steady, daily, unglamorous accumulation of the real things you built with your own hands, until one day you looked up and the old story was smaller than it used to be and the thing you'd built was larger. There was no lesson in that which fit cleanly into a sentence. There rarely was, in anything that actually mattered. What she knew was this: the people who had expected her to fail had underestimated one thing, and it wasn't her intelligence or her determination or any of the qualities a story like this one was supposed to be about. What they had underestimated was her patience, her willingness to stay in a cold room with a problem that had no quick solution and work it until it moved. Her ability to keep going on days when the work was ugly and the outcome was uncertain and nobody was watching. That was not a heroic quality. It was not photogenic. It was the kind of thing that looked from the outside like stubbornness or desperation or the absence of other options. From the inside, she knew what it actually was. It was the decision, made and remade every morning, to be still there when the day came that it mattered. She was still there. The ranch was alive. The wire on the north fence was holding.